Over 1,000 insurgents died in 6 hours. No warning, no mercy, just fire, precision, obliteration, and behind it all, Captain Ibrahim, the man who turned drones into thunder, the ambush that silenced a continent, the moment Africa stopped waiting. Subscribe now for stories that reveal the fire and future of a rising Africa. Over 1,000 insurgents were wiped out in a single night. No warning, no mercy, just fire from the sky. 3 drones, backed by ground forces, turned the Arbinda corridor into a war zone of smoke and silence. But how did Burkina Faso, once dismissed, once mocked as vulnerable, pull off the most ruthless ambush in the entire history of the Sahel? Let's find out. Before the drones ever took flight, before the Cobra commandos even moved into position, before a single bullet was fired, Burkina Faso was already at war. Not the kind that makes headlines, not the kind they show on flashy television screens. No, this was the silent kind. The kind fought in the shadows, where intelligence is worth more than artillery, where a whisper can decide the fate of an entire battalion. It began months earlier. Captain Ibrahim had just tightened his grip on power and made one thing brutally, unmistakably clear. Burkina Faso would not wait for anyone to rescue it. The foreign military bases, they had been shown the door, the so-called international aid. It came with too many strings and too many suits who never stepped foot in the villages they claimed to help. What Captain Ibrahim needed now wasn't more money. It wasn't more speeches. It was something far more dangerous to his enemies. It was information. Because in a country where insurgents often looked like neighbors and ambushes came out of nowhere, knowledge wasn't just power, it was survival. So Traore turned to the most overlooked resource in any war. Not foreign analysts, not elite advisors, but the people, the villagers, the farmers, the displaced, the wounded, the very ones who had watched terror rise right from their front doors. And so began what some now call the Whisper War. Across the northern provinces, discreet networks of civilian informants were reactivated and expanded. But these weren't traditional spies. They were shepherds who had memorized the new footpaths forged by insurgents. They were women who quietly counted the number of motorcycles passing through their towns. They were children trained to spot unfamiliar dialects, strange behaviors, quiet signs of danger. And from all these pieces, a picture began to emerge, one that foreign satellites had never captured. And as this intelligence flowed, it wasn't processed by some distant bureaucrats in European capitals. No, it was processed by new Burkini tactical cells, created to adapt, analyze, and act in real time. But even the sharpest information wasn't enough. To strike first, to strike hard, the army needed something it had never truly possessed: predictive vision. This wasn't about reacting, it was about preempting. That's when Captain Traore rewrote the rules of engagement. He didn't just restructure the military, he empowered it. He authorized a joint command structure unlike any used by past governments. No more silos, no more slow chains of command. Data from local informants was now merged with real-time drone reconnaissance. Civilian volunteers, known as the VDP, the Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland, worked side by side with elite military strategists in real time. This fusion created something rare in modern warfare: a decentralized, people-powered intelligence network. And that network began pointing toward one growing threat. For weeks, patterns emerged. A militant convoy was building in size, slowly, quietly, moving supplies and fighters through the Arbinda corridor. It wasn't just a hit squad. It was an entire mobile war machine, preparing for something big, something coordinated, something dangerous. But they were overconfident. They thought they were invisible. After all, hadn't Burkina Faso always failed to detect such moves before? But this time was different. What they didn't know was that small drones, some no larger than birds, were already watching them from above. Some hovered for hours, hidden behind sunlight and cloud cover, mapping every curve, every turn that convoy made. Others moved far ahead, confirming ambush points before a single man stepped foot. Burkina engineers had recently upgraded these drones, improving their range and targeting precision, not with foreign contractors, not with outsourced firms, but with local expertise and cooperation from new allies, far outside the old Western sphere. Back on the ground, snipers were being trained in newly calculated kill zones. The VDP militias dug hidden bunkers near natural choke points. Helicopter teams rehearsed night maneuvers in silence. And most importantly, every unit involved was told just one thing: don't act yet, hold, because patience was the deadliest part of the plan. For nearly 2 months, that convoy was tracked, documented, studied. The point wasn't just to strike, it was to strike when the damage would be irreversible. By the time the convoy crossed into the final stretch of the Arbinda corridor, the battlefield was already set. Not a single militant suspected it. Not a single foreign analyst predicted it. But to the Burkina forces, this wasn't sudden. It was the end of a long, quiet build-up, a campaign where information was the gunpowder, and Captain Ibrahim was just waiting, calm and still, to light the fuse. By the time the convoy reached the trap, they weren't just moving, they were marching, straight into history. The Arbinda corridor stretched ahead of them, a road they had crossed before without resistance, a path that once felt predictable. A comfortable routine had set in. Loot, transport, regroup. The insurgents, numbering in the hundreds, packed into technicals, motorcycles and transport trucks, believed this was just another leg, just another checkpoint of a growing operation. But what they didn't realize was that they weren't traveling through Burkina Faso anymore. They were moving inside a calibrated kill zone. The ground beneath them, it wasn't random terrain. It had been mapped down to the last shrub. Every bend, every tree line, every single inch of road had been calculated for maximum exposure. And more importantly, every possible escape route had already been sealed. Before the convoy even got close, the first strike came without a sound. A drone, hovering high above like a patient vulture, released a guided missile that tore through the lead vehicle. An armored pickup packed with heavy weapons. It wasn't just about creating an explosion. That hit was surgical. It severed the head of the snake. The rest of the convoy, caught completely off guard, slammed their brakes. Some reversed, others panicked. But that chaos, that was the point. Within 30 seconds, a second drone dropped a deadly payload on the tail vehicle, cutting off their retreat, sealing their fate. What came next wasn't just an airstrike, it was a coordinated ballet of destruction. 3 drones weaved in and out of vision, switching altitudes, shifting positions, dancing through the air like silent predators. They weren't just bombing, they were herding, pushing the insurgents toward tight choke points, where Cobra commando teams were already in place, watching, waiting. But the ground forces didn't fire immediately. They held back. They let the panic grow, let confusion twist into desperation. And then came the signal. Not a trumpet, not a radio command, just a drone, cutting its lights and hovering motionless right above the center of the convoy. That was the cue. From the tree lines, snipers opened fire, not wild shooting, not warning shots, pinpoint accuracy, taking out commanders, spotters, and radio operators first. These weren't lucky hits. These were rehearsed targets, faces memorized through weeks of close-range surveillance. And as leadership inside the convoy collapsed, a full-scale ground assault erupted. Cobra commando units surged from the north, while BIR forces swept in hard from the east, forming a brutal, unforgiving pincer. Helicopters roared in from a nearby base, spitting suppressive fire with mounted machine guns, as flares lit up the night sky like thunderclaps. This wasn't just about killing, this was about psychological dominance. Every sound, every flash, every move was designed to break the insurgents' rhythm, to make them feel not just outnumbered, but hunted. But there was one more element, one thing that made this ambush unlike anything the Sahel had ever seen before: the volunteers for the defense of the homeland. These were not career soldiers. They weren't trained in foreign academies. If it were you, would you stand with Captain Ibrahim? Comment below and type Amen if you support his fight. They were farmers, ex-mechanics, shopkeepers, trained fast, deployed faster. And yet, on that night, they fought with a fury and a precision that stunned even the elite forces beside them. They weren't fighting for medals. They weren't fighting for orders. They had lost family, homes, whole villages to the insurgency. So their rage had purpose. And under Traore's new doctrine, they were no longer the background, no longer the afterthought. They were the front line. The insurgents tried to scatter, but even those who fled into the brush met their end. Tripwire explosives had been laid across escape routes. Anti-personnel traps ensured no easy exit. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. For 6 hours, the battle raged. But to call it a battle would miss the point. It was an execution, measured, coordinated, and absolute. By sunrise, smoke hung in the air like a curtain of mourning. Over 1,000 insurgents were down. Dozens more crawled away, bleeding into the sand. Many of them captured alive. Each one a future source of intelligence. And not a single Birken Bay village had been touched. Not a single innocent life was lost. But perhaps the most powerful image wasn't the destruction itself. It was what came after. Soldiers didn't celebrate. There was no looting, no gloating, no grand gestures, just calm, controlled withdrawal. Drones circled once more, not to strike, but to confirm. And as the radio silence lifted and the code word for mission success was finally transmitted, the message of victory began to spread. Not through official press releases, not through polished speeches, but through people. Word of mouth, phone calls, shared video clips. The nation didn't learn about the ambush from generals. They heard it from each other. Because this was more than military. It was cultural, something old, something broken, had just been buried in that corridor. But what rose in its place? What tools gave Burkina Faso this new edge? And how did drones, often dismissed as toys of rich nations, become the nation's deadliest sword? Now, when the last gunshot echoed off the Arbinda corridor and the dust began to settle, it was clear. The true architect of the operation wasn't just on the ground. The real turning point had unfolded in the sky. The 3 drones that executed the strikes weren't just machines. They were instruments of a new era, and they didn't arrive by accident. Long before that night, Captain Ibrahim had understood something that most of the region's generals ignored. Warfare had evolved. The enemies in Burkina Faso weren't massing in tanks. They weren't marching in columns like the wars of old. They were hiding, in plain sight, blending with the terrain, adapting with terrifying speed. Fighting them required more than just courage. It demanded eyes that never blinked. And so, quietly, without fanfare or applause, Captain Ibrahim made a decision. He invested in the one domain insurgents feared, but could never control: the sky. Unlike the flashy purchases made for international headlines, Burkina Faso's drone program didn't grow in the spotlight. It grew in the shadows. These weren't surplus imports from Western stockpiles. They weren't dusty hand-me-downs from NATO partners. No, this program had fingerprints from a different direction. From alliances the West might frown upon, but ones that offered advanced tech with fewer strings attached and far more precision. Ibrahim didn't just buy drones. He built a doctrine. He recruited young engineers. Some trained abroad, others self-taught through online forums and underground networks, and gave them a challenge: transform these devices into the new nerve system of national defense. No middlemen, no red tape, just results. And the result? A drone fleet tailored for Burkina Faso's war, not anyone else's. Some drones were high-altitude scouts, equipped with thermal imaging, able to hover for hours, mapping human movement across jagged terrain. Others were agile strikers, fast, brutal, capable of locking onto a moving target and eliminating it in under 8 seconds. But perhaps the most brilliant addition of all was the micro-drone unit. Tiny machines, small enough to slip through forest canopies, quiet enough to hover near insurgent camps undetected, and powerful enough to stream real-time intel back to command centers buried deep in Burkina's interior. And then came the training, not just for drone pilots, but for entire field teams. Ground forces were taught to think like drone operators, to move in coordination with eyes in the sky. Platoons learned to wait for aerial visual cues before engaging. Laser targeting systems were integrated into helmet visors, and even VDP fighters, once poorly equipped and isolated, were now given simplified drone interfaces, tools to spot, mark, and track enemies during their patrols. Suddenly, the entire battlefield became interconnected. It wasn't about firepower anymore. It was about awareness. Insurgents found themselves walking into ambushes that felt psychic. Their camps were hit just hours after being built. Convoys were destroyed before their own scouts could send warnings. Confusion reigned in insurgent radio chatter. They spoke of betrayal, of invisible soldiers, of supernatural enemies. But it wasn't magic. It was math. It was code. And it was the decision to let drones become more than tools. They became teammates. What made this transformation even more remarkable was how quickly it happened. Within just a few months of Captain Ibrahim's drone directive, the military of Burkina Faso began operating at a level that analysts would later call fourth-generation coordination. That's military speak for seamless integration of air, land, and intelligence in real time, something even richer nations still struggle to achieve. And yet, here was a landlocked West African country, once mocked as defenseless, now deploying synchronized drone strikes and coordinated ground assaults that left hardened insurgents scrambling for survival. But this wasn't just a battlefield story. This leap, this technological awakening, had ripple effects far beyond the trenches. It redefined what leadership looked like in Burkina, no longer just about speeches or medals or parades in capital squares. It became about something more powerful, vision. In Captain Ibrahim, many no longer saw just a president. They saw a systems builder, a man who understood that sovereignty wasn't just held in borders, but in bandwidth. His drone doctrine became a mirror, held up to the world, and it declared boldly, "We do not need your outdated blueprints. We are writing our own." But as drone footage went viral, as headlines marveled at Burkina Faso's deadly precision, one question grew louder. What message was Captain Ibrahim sending? To his people, to the insurgents, and to the foreign powers still circling the Sahel like vultures? Yes, victory is intoxicating. It lifts nations, it boosts morale, it silences critics. But it also brings something far more dangerous: expectations. The ambush in Arbinda wasn't just a tactical win. It was a rupture in the narrative, a break in the script, a night that flipped Burkina Faso's image from victim to vanguard. Captain Ibrahim had thrown a stone so massive into the stagnant waters of Sahel geopolitics that its ripples spread beyond borders. But now that the dust has settled, the real question emerges. What now? Because the scale, the precision, the sheer clarity of the Arbinda operation has set a new standard, not just for the enemies watching, but for the Burkinabe people themselves. Captain Ibrahim has raised the bar. He's shown what the state can do when it stops depending and starts deciding. But with that comes a paradox, because anything less from this point forward will feel like failure. This is the burden of success. The public has now awakened to what local defense forces and national leadership can actually achieve when united. And from here on out, every future attack, every incursion, every tragedy that slips through the net, will not be met with sympathy. It will be met with demand. Where once the question was, can our army do this? Now the question becomes, why didn't they? And that is where the true test begins. Not on the battlefield, but in sustainability. Because as efficient, as masterful as the Arbinda ambush was, operations like these come at a heavy cost. Not only in equipment, not only in ammunition, but in logistics, in human coordination, and most critically, in the constant upkeep of real-time intelligence. Surveillance systems must run around the clock. Informant networks need protection. Drones need fuel, software updates, routine repairs. Soldiers, they need rest. They need retraining. And most of all, they need trust. Trust that the state has their back long after the gunfire stops. And this kind of military infrastructure can't be stitched together with adrenaline and patriotism alone. What's more, there's the psychological toll. This kind of warfare, fast, high-tech, always on, can wear down even the most disciplined, the most motivated. Volunteers, for all their bravery, are not machines. The moment fatigue sets in, the moment communication begins to lag, that's when the advantage starts to slip. And the enemy, they're not static, they're not done. Militant groups, although bloodied, are not extinct. Operations of this magnitude often force them to adapt. They break into smaller cells, they retreat deeper into forested hideouts, they change routes, they learn. Some may even cross borders, dragging Burkina Faso into tense standoffs with neighboring states whose security forces are less advanced or less committed. And as the country asserts itself militarily, it risks something else, becoming a regional magnet, attracting threats it never asked for. Then there's the political terrain. Captain Ibrahim's leadership, built on boldness, clarity, and defiance, thrives on momentum. But sovereignty is not sustained by charisma alone. Roads must be rebuilt, power grids must be repaired, schools, courts, clinics, all must return to function, institutions must be fortified, and most importantly, the civilians who cheered this military victory must begin to feel the dividends of peace. Because security, without stability, becomes a paradox. You cannot protect a population that has no jobs, no clean water, no schools, and no justice. And Captain Ibrahim knows this. He's already begun experimenting with military-led development programs. Troops building roads, troops growing food, troops helping restore local markets, not as conquerors, but as stewards. Because the road from emergency defense to long-term governance is long, winding, and full of landmines, some political, others literal. Externally, the Arbinda ambush has also complicated Burkina Faso's position. Yes, the world took notice, but not all eyes watching are friendly. International powers that once dismissed the country now look with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. How did a landlocked nation under sanctions pull off such a flawless, coordinated strike? What new alliances made it possible? And more importantly, will others in the region try to follow Captain Ibrahim's model? These are not small questions. These are tectonic shifts. Burkina Faso is no longer seen as a passive client state, waiting for handouts or directives. It is now a symbol, a precedent, and that makes it a target, not just for insurgents, but for those who fear what a self-determined Africa might become. Because the real war, some might say, is only just beginning. Building a sovereign state isn't just about pushing out foreign soldiers or dropping missiles on militants. It's about creating a system that can survive victory, a system that doesn't crumble under pressure, doesn't drift during peacetime, and doesn't forget the people it was built to serve. Captain Ibrahim's drones may have cleaned the corridor, his commandos may have taken out the convoy, but now, his greatest battle is a slower one, a quieter one without applause or viral footage. It's the war for endurance, The war for legitimacy. The war for a future, where Burkina Faso is not just free, but unshakable. And this time, the battlefield is the nation itself. Is it time for more African nations to follow the path of Captain Ibrahim? Can sovereignty truly be defended without permission from the old powers? And what would a continent look like if it stood on its own terms? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe in the rise of a strong, self-reliant Africa, type "I stand with Africa" in the comments. If this story moved you, like the video, share it with someone who still believes in the soul of this continent. And subscribe to our channel for more stories on Black resilience, leadership, history, and pride. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again in the next story of the New Africa.